All right, welcome to another episode of the National Pulse. It is Saturday, October 16, the year of our Lord 2021, and I started to record this episode yesterday, and I have this whole new setup here, so that I can podcast for you when I'm on the go. I've been getting a lot of, I wouldn't say complaints, but let's say queries as I've been traveling. So I invested in a portable system. You'll have far more podcasts from me as a result, but I've been fidgeting around with it for the last 24 hours trying to figure out how to use this thing. And I started recording this episode yesterday. Just ran out of battery in the device. Just thought I could, speak into 2 AA batteries for 4 hours and that would work. It didn't, obviously. So we're doing it again. So welcome again. Not that you heard the last one. And we're broadcasting today out of New York, New York. I was feeling a little ropey this morning. So I went down from where I'm staying, just found the first pizza place this afternoon. And I took a bite. Well, I bought it first. Then I took a bite, and it was just phenomenal. And I looked up on, the pizza man. What's his name? Dave Portnoy. I looked up on his rankings, on his website, the One Bite website. What this random pizza place here down on First Avenue on the Upper East Side was ranked at, and he gave it an 8.5, and I feel like that's a pretty good score. I would have given it an 8.5. I thought he'd come in lower, so I was very pleased with that. Now I've got my energy back. We can jump right into the conversation here. Lots, obviously, to talk about, but the one big story that's been stuck in my mind over the last day is this story from back home, and the tragic and also just disgusting story of Sir David Amess, Member of Parliament, who was murdered while doing his job as a British Member of Parliament. In the UK, we have things called constituency surgeries. That means that you're one-on-one with your constituent, and usually there are no police or security at these events, and unfortunately, I guess, and appallingly, 25-year-old Somalian immigrant into the United Kingdom took advantage of that fact and stabbed Sir David Amess multiple times during that event. He passed away shortly thereafter. And I want to bring into the conversation here an old friend of mine. He's been on the show before. Benjamin Harris-Quinney is the chairman of the Bow Group. It's the oldest conservative think tank, I think, in the world. And he has known Sir David Amess for a long time, has worked with him, has hosted conversations and discussions via the Bow Group and other groups with Sir David Amess. So I want to bring Ben into the conversation here. Ben, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Ben, obviously, I mean, it goes without saying, what happened yesterday was absolutely just heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching. I think about that sort of thing all the time, as I get evil eyes in the streets, especially in New York from time to time. I wonder, is there a nutter somewhere around the corner, who wants to take advantage of open and easy access, and this did happen to Sir David Amess. Your first thoughts on, the incident and your memories of Sir David?
Well, obviously, the first thought that I had was total shock. Where I saw it, that he'd been stabbed and died. It's surreal because suddenly he was a very unassuming guy, and he was a backbencher, which means that he was really focused on local issues, constituency issues. He was a well-known figure in Westminster, but not a well-known figure in the country. He happened to be well-known to the Bow Group and myself, and suddenly this guy is the focus of such a shocking terrorist incident that I think we haven't seen in the United Kingdom for a fair time. It's been, I think, 5 or 6 years since there's been a terrorist incident of this significance and severity. And I suppose, unfortunately, perhaps in part due to the pandemic, we'd kind of gotten used to these things not happening all the time, as they were. If you went back 10 years or so, it was a lot more common, and it seemed like Islamic terrorism particularly had died down a bit, and it's come back with a vengeance with this incident. I mean, on a personal level, David was a very unique character. He was a funny guy, good sense of humor. I mean, just very strong, positive energy about him, which was very different to me. But he I mean, when you have these terrible incidents occur, there is a tendency towards hyperbole, and the person in question, the victim, could do no wrong. But it really was the case with Sir David that he always had a smile on his face, and he seemed to just love politics, and he never lost that enthusiasm for it, which you were alluding to, perhaps that you've lost a bit and I've lost a bit over the years with the sort of the vicious environment that it presents. But he didn't seem to see any of that, and so it's a particular tragedy that he's been victim to, the very worst of it, really.
So, just correct me if I'm wrong. He's served as a member of Parliament for what, 38, 39 years?
Yeah, he was elected in 1983, I believe. Which is, I mean, he was elected before I was born, and he was seen as a poster boy of the Thatcher movement because it had been the first time that a Conservative had won in that constituency, I think, of Basildon. And that was in an area of the UK which was not traditionally Conservative. And so he was seen as evidence that Margaret Thatcher was reaching new parts of the country that the Conservative Party had never been reached, more working class people. And, David himself was from a relatively humble background by comparison to a lot of Conservative MPs, certainly at the time. And he was a very, very strong supporter of Margaret Thatcher and everything Margaret Thatcher tried to do. And actually, he was one of the very, very few number of MPs left that were a key part of that Thatcher movement and the Brexit movement that has just occurred. So he was a very principled Conservative, or simply he was a Conservative, which is actually quite unusual now in the Conservative Party. Yes, one of the last remainders of that caliber of person and caliber of politician. So long career, huge success throughout his career against the odds, both with the Thatcher movement and the Brexit movement and many other things. I mean, you couldn't really reel off all the things he's achieved in politics, but those were, two major changes that changed the United Kingdom in very significant ways, and he was a big part of that. So yeah, a 40-year career with very significant achievements, and from every time I spoke to him, he was certainly not winding up.
Right.
He had a lot of things he still wanted to do.
Well, we have a predominantly American audience, not solely, but predominantly American audience, and so I want to get onto the question of motivation here and immigration, specifically, the mass migration that Europe has had to put up with for so long, and how that conversation is now being had in the United Kingdom. So let's start maybe with the motivation side of things. It obviously struck me that when Joe Cox, another member of Parliament, was murdered about 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago now. within moments, really, in real time, we knew that the attacker was this neo-Nazi guy who had stabbed her in the street, and the police and the media didn't have any kind of problem talking about that. Yesterday was a little slower. We still don't really know all that much about this man, apart from that obviously he's a murderer, he's a terrorist, and he's 25 years old and from Somalia. You're getting the usual drip of maybe he was, on some counter-terror, anti-radicalization watch list or what have you. And of course, we'll probably start hearing the refrain shortly about mental health, and he was mentally unwell and all of this stuff. But I do look at Sir David's track record, his history, and I cannot reconcile that this was motivated by him or his policies or his politics. It seems to me like this may have been, an arbitrary target. Is that something you concur with, or is there anything that that would have led to this person being, particularly interested in Sir David Amess?
No, I mean, he wasn't a cabinet minister, he wasn't a member of the government, so he didn't have that kind of profile. He was, generally on the right of the spectrum, a small C conservative, but also a very, very committed Christian. And so he would do a lot of charity outreach work. And, as a man, he was extremely friendly. So he's not someone that engaged in sort of highly divisive use of language, or he wasn't always in Twitter spats. I don't even think he was on Twitter, and so in that sense he doesn't have the profile or the character that you would think there's going to be a target for either an Islamist or someone on the left or someone really in any way in politics, because he was pretty well liked across the political spectrum. The way the quarters of the left have reacted to this so far, just today, have been to say that this individual shouldn't be described as someone of Somalian origin. Right. He was a British citizen, apparently, so he should be talked about as a British citizen as much as anyone else. But I'm not sure that's right, because my view is that we should have been and need to be a lot tighter on who we're letting into this country. Approximately 1 million people a year migrate to Britain, and maybe he shouldn't have been a British citizen. Right. Maybe we should look a bit more closely, and maybe we shouldn't be letting a lot of these people in. So the debate has quickly shifted to that identity politic. Should we be talking about him as being a Muslim? Should we be talking about him as being of Somalian origin? I obviously think we should, because I think that's the truth of what has occurred here. I don't know any more about the case than anyone else, but you and I have seen these cases so many times in the past,
and all across Europe, by the way.
Yeah, well, all across the West, all across the world. And they tend to go down in a very similar way. And these motivations come from people that hate the country they are in. This person has come to the United Kingdom, and as you say, I think it's more likely that his hatred is not for David Amess. His hatred is for our way of life and Western democracy and Judeo-Christian heritage and all of those things, and that's the motivation in most of these cases, and I don't think we can shy away from that reality.
See, one of the things I worry about when you take what we saw and what we actually continue to see, but what we really had to wring our hands about, just over here, it was just horrific to watch that Afghanistan withdrawal, the botched way it went down, and specifically immediately afterwards, this war crime committed by Joe Biden, where he instructed, or somebody around him instructed, a drone to target this family as a means by which to sort of save some face, perhaps, after being attacked, after American servicemen were killed outside the Hamid Karzai airport. And I wonder, and like you said, we don't have any of this information, mostly because the authorities are not forthcoming with information at the moment. Which the journalist in me is just screaming, why do we not know more about this person yet? I don't even think we have a name yet, at least not at the time of this this podcast going out. And I look at things like that, globalist foreign policy, how it impacts people in Afghanistan, those families that have lost children. 7 children were killed in that drone strike. And of course, we've seen similar things taking place in Somalia and elsewhere in the world as well. And I just think I was one of those people who said, no, look, it's not because of Western foreign policy that these attacks are happening in the West. It's because they hate our way of life. But it's both of those things. And I wonder and I worry that perhaps this person has some kind of homeland-related grudge against the West and is exacting that revenge. I noted that in the immediate aftermath of that drone strike, the remaining members of the family that lived with that man who was killed, along with 9 of his family members, their immediate thing was, when they gave an interview, they said, we'd really like to move to America. We feel like that would be the trade-off, here, almost. And I just think, why on earth would you trust that those people would not attempt some kind of, vengeance-based retribution once they get here? And these are the really odd kind of minutiae of these kind of moments that we have to deal with. And like you said right at the beginning, maybe we need to look into these people a bit more and discriminate a bit more about their backgrounds and motivations, and see maybe the West drone striked his uncle or something, and this is, you see what I'm saying? We don't know, so we have to speculate. But there's obviously going to be a motivation somewhere. And I just wonder if it's like that directly related or tangential. And again, to raise this, I am loath to hear, the phrase mental health. And I like to joke about that because they always say Islamic attackers are mentally unwell. And I always just respond, well, if Islam makes you mentally unwell, then if that's what the political establishment is saying, then fair play to them. They're not saying that, or they don't think they're saying that. But in the minds of the public, I mean, it's a gibberish way of escaping accountability. So how does one find accountability? Like you said, it's novel to be a conservative within the Conservative Party nowadays, and at the same time that David Amess was being stabbed, and in the immediate aftermath of that, images of illegal migrants being pulled up onto the shores of Britain was still going on at that very point in time, and will still be going on for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, well, I would say that the thing that David Amess was most passionate about in his political life was being pro-life. And I don't think he would have made a distinction between the death of a family in Afghanistan and the death of someone in a terrorist incident in Britain. As far as he was concerned, from his Christian perspective, life is sacred. And there's no hierarchy in that regard. But I think what I find most frustrating about this, and I was still at school when 9/11 happened and the war on terror, but I was very much against the Iraq War and the general Middle East engagement, which of course in the United Kingdom context occurred under the Blair government. But I think a lot of people have now come to see Bush as, not as more establishment than conservative, and that there is a very strong movement now, thankfully, to question why the United States and we in the West are getting involved in all these conflicts throughout the world that don't have a clear benefit to the citizens of our countries. And so when we talk about a reaction to, or a reaction against our way of life, I don't think drone striking a family in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria represents my way of life. I don't think it represents the way of life of most British people. I don't think it represents a Judeo-Christian way of life. I don't think it represents the sort of view of the world that David Amess had. And so you've got two wrongs here, basically. And so I don't, and those two wrongs create a cycle of discord in the world. They create displacement of people coming from places that to the west that shouldn't have been coming to the west, of grudges and horrific acts that lead to other horrific acts. So I think both things are a wrong, but from a security policy point of view, I think you've got to take the position of being far tougher. Whatever wrongs the UK have committed in the past, whatever wrongs the United States have committed in the past, that doesn't mean that you take a lax approach to who you're letting into your country. And what we saw with the recent debacle, as you say, in Afghanistan, was a lot of people being waved through. I think about 25,000 people from Afghanistan are either coming into the United Kingdom or have been earmarked to come into the United Kingdom, many of whom were waved through even without any documentation. So no passport, no identification. We don't know who these people are. We sort of got swept up in this moral panic. And, we know in the past things like the Manchester bombings and a number of terrorist incidents in the past, that people that have come into this country, into the United Kingdom as refugees, have gone on to commit terrorist atrocities. And, you can call me racist or prejudiced or whatever, but I think when you've got people coming from countries like Somalia, countries like Afghanistan, countries like Syria, you have got to look at that person under a microscope from a security point of view. And if there is any doubt at all, I think they shouldn't be allowed into the United Kingdom, because there's clearly a pattern, and it might only be 1 in 1,000 of them that pose a threat, but why take the risk?
Well, I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I've now written 2 books, broadly about these subjects, no-go zones, where I went to a lot of these areas across Europe and even in the US and the UK. And Enoch was right, in analysing the level of assimilation and integration and how much people sign up to what we sort of flippantly describe as our way of life, but I think we do so little now, not just as individuals, but including as individuals, but as a civilization, to either assert or even look inwardly and try and identify. I'm not sure it's apparent to people anymore, and to the point where, Julie Kelly from American Greatness magazine the other day tweeted something like, "I don't identify as a conservative anymore." She was talking about because conservatives tend to lose, to be weak, to not want to take the fight and wield the power necessary to win. And I replied, but what is there to conserve anyway? What about now? What about today? Would you look at and go, yeah, that is the thing that we need to really, build on? There isn't anything like that. It's the things, what we're really doing is reforming or restoring. And there's this whole conversation now. Go ahead.
I consider myself to be a conservative revolutionary, in the sense that Roger Scruton, who was one of the greatest conservative philosophers Britain has ever produced, he was a patron of the Bow Group, sadly passed away a few years ago. And his view of conservatism was that conservatism isn't about conserving the status quo, however you may find it. Conservatism is a fixed point that has been determined by enough human history that we know what works. We know what builds strong societies. We know what builds virtuous lives and citizenry. We know the core pillars, the natural family, nationhood, faith. And so in that sense, conservatism isn't just about saying, let's keep everything how it is now. It's about actually moving to a point, returning to a point, or finding the point for the first time of what makes a strong and virtuous and moral society. So that's how I see conservatism. But in terms of today's society, I would want to preserve almost nothing.
Right.
We have sadly, over the last certainly 50, 60 years in the West, we have destroyed ourselves. It is not an external threat. We've had, even in our careers, we came up at a similar time, you and I, and we've had the threat of just the tail end of the threat of Russia, the threat of Islamism, sort of return to Russia, although a lot of it obviously nonsense, the threat of China. But none of these threats actually, they weren't right at our door. Right. They weren't ready to cross the threshold. But the threats that have crossed the threshold and were ready to cross the threshold have been self-imposed. And so, no, I would want to preserve almost none of that. And I think, in terms of David Amess's political philosophy, his life spanned a time where I guess, Britain fell away in that regard. And the Thatcher movements and the Brexit movements were kind of raging against the tide. Yeah. But unfortunately, we'd have to say that the tide has been stronger over those 50 years.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are pressed for time here. I got about 4 or 5 more minutes here, Ben. Is there anything else you think about this situation? I tell you what is really interesting to me, and I suppose you might be the best person to remark upon this. Is how they replace Sir David Amess in Parliament. Now, typically you would have a by-election, a special election, as they would call it, here in the US, and you might get other candidates from other parties running. Typically speaking, that doesn't properly happen when an incident like this occurs. I think the best way to kind of remark upon it, I saw on Twitter earlier, was we can't allow terrorism to change the political makeup of the parliament or be seen to be that way, and therefore it's a good idea for everybody else, all the other parties, to just not field candidates. But I know you've got some pretty strong feelings about a Conservative Party replacement for Sir David Amess.
Yeah, well, David can't speak for himself, but I think he was someone who loved democracy. And I remember actually I was involved in organising, I was helping out a student debating society organise an event. And we contacted David to speak. And he said, I'm more than happy to come and speak, unless you can get a bigger name, and then I'll drop out. And he did that sort of thing up and down the country, going to these student debates, which is very different to what it is in the United States. You don't get a penny piece. You don't even get your train fare in most cases. It's just for people who are passionate about debate and passionate about airing ideas. So I don't think he would want to shut down the debates. I don't think he would want to have a one-candidate election. And the issue I have with it particularly is that the assumption is that, we'll replace him with another Conservative candidate and therefore there'll be a continuation. But the Conservative Party now has repudiated pretty much all of David Amess's views. And so the likelihood is the candidate that you will get in might have the same party name, but will be of a completely different political viewpoint. And so I think in these situations, we've got to take the attitude of we're not going to allow terrorism to shut down democracy, and we're going to continue that debate, the debate that he was passionate about, and the democracy that he was passionate about. And I'm sure that whoever the Conservative candidate is will win. But I do think it's important that they have that debate, and perhaps we expose the fact that everyone's talking about what a great guy David Amess was, despite a few days ago calling him far right and evil and all the rest of it. And I think it's right that we have a debate about his views, about his Christian faith, about his pro-life, anti-abortion viewpoints, and we recognise that these are not evil things. These are legitimate points of debate that he had, and if justice is done, really, his replacement will be someone that takes those views forward rather than just takes a party name forward. I
quite agree. Ben Harris-Quinney, the chairman of the Bow Group, the is it the oldest conservative think tank in the world?
It is, in the world.
In the world. And where can people find you?
Bowgroup.org or on Twitter at Bowgroup.
Or on Getter at Bowgroup also. Ben Harris-Quinney, thank you so much for joining us again. Cheers.
Okay.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I that worked. It appears that appeared to have worked. So I'm quite happy with the system that they sold me. It's probably paid over the odds for it. Want to say a great big thank you to our newly joined members over at fundrealnews.com. We are people powered, remember, ladies and gentlemen. So you can go to fundrealnews.com. There are all sorts of perks, by the way, that come with signing up as a member. You can get signed copies of my books and telephone calls with me, one-on-ones, all of that. Fundrealnews.com. So thank you to the latest members, Todd and Keith and James and Willard, Stephen, Joseph, Stephen, Linton, Jean, Cynthia, Vicky, Peter, Michael, Mark, Linda, Angela, Dave, Martha, Cheryl, and Richard. I want to remind you all to get on Getter. That's gettr.com. That's where real free speech lives nowadays. I think I have something like, I'm going to check, 528,000 odd followers. I know they combine your Twitter following and your Getter following, but still, that's a pretty sizable following. If you get on Getter and post under one of my posts that you joined because of the National Pulse or the National Pulse podcast, I will be sure to share that message, pick you up a few more followers. Remember, the nationalpulse.com, I actually just published a new article as well, but the USAID under Joe Biden has launched a new $125 million project to find 12,000 new viruses. It seems like a horrific idea if I ever heard of one. Go and check that out. Exclusive reporting by the great Natalie Winters, who will be joining me on the show in the next coming days. In the meantime, make sure you're picking up a copy of Peter Navarro's book, In Trump Time. You can get that at bit.ly, that's bit.ly/Pulse Podcast, bit.ly/Pulse Podcast, and I'll see you again very soon.